It makes people go nuts. If you're so scared of offending somebody in the workplace, you go to training, never tell a joke, you might offend somebody, ask somebody what their preferred pronoun is. You might as well have a big blinking light that says, don't be yourself.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf. My guest today is Phillip Howard, who is the author of a new book, Everyday Freedom, Designing the Framework for a Flourishing Society, and he also runs an organization called Common Good. Phil, thanks for coming on.
Nice to be with you, Tom.
I'm wondering first if you can tell me a little bit more about your background I know you've written books for a number of years, you're running this organization, Common Good. Where do you come from? What was the education of Phillip Howard like?
I grew up in Eastern Kentucky. My father was a Presbyterian minister, so I had it was like living in the 19th century, even though it was in the mid-20th century. It's working on farms and odd jobs and such. I got scholarships to Eastern schools when I was a teenager, so I went to boarding school, Taft School, and then to Yale, never having visited either school before I showed up. My real break came when, through a friend of my father's at the church in Knoxville, where he had retired to, I got a job at the Oak Ridge National Lab after my freshman year in college, and ended up being assigned to be the gopher to a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Eugene Wigner, and worked there for 3 summers, ultimately publishing papers on post-nuclear war recovery as a teenager. So it was, I got a sort of a full immersion indoctrination into sort of public policy thinking and analysis with really good mentors who were not, who were very action oriented. They were, they didn't care whether somebody had a degree or not. They didn't care if they were, a college student or or a PhD, and they just wanted to explore better ideas. So that was a great break. I ultimately went to law school, became a civic leader in New York City, and in the course of running the equivalent of the local zoning board for Lower Manhattan, and then being the chairman of a sort of the leading land use civic group called the Municipal Arts Society. That was the group Save Grand Central Terminal, that sort of thing. Started thinking again about the dysfunctions of government and why my friends in government couldn't do what they thought made sense, which seemed crazy to me. I mean, what's the point of going to work for government if you can't actually take responsibility? So that ultimately led to me thinking about the legal structure of government. I ended up hiring an intellectual historian to give me a tutorial in the early 90s, just because I was curious, where this had come from. And I didn't intend at the start to write a book, but that ultimately became The Death of Common Sense, which came out in 1995 and was a big bestseller. And all of a sudden I found myself as sort of a leading thinker on how legal structures affect how government works, and then how it affects how citizens behave. And the more I thought about it, I have one idea really, that only people make things happen. I've managed to parlay that one idea into 7 books so far. So it's it turns out to be a somewhat deeper subject than I initially thought. But
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show.
So I've, done this now for almost 30 years.
Yeah, and I read The Death of Common Sense, and I thought, at the time of reading it a few years ago, I thought it was pretty eye-opening and gave a lot of great examples and explaining a lot of the problems. If I had to distill it down into a sentence, it would be something like, what happens, or the problem with like a very onerous proceduralism and how that engenders a sense of powerlessness. And I think powerlessness in freedom is, of course, the theme of everyday freedom. What for you, at what point did it first kind of tip off in your mind where you were beginning to understand the problem with these very rigid, comprehensive, rule books and structures?
There was a moment when I was working on The Death of Common Sense where I I had some mental barrier in my mind, and I had read in the course of the study, I'd really studied Friedrich Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty and such, but there was something about it that didn't strike me as quite right, and I kept running up into a wall, both with conservative ideology and certainly with liberal ideology. And finally, I had this insight, which is that if you try to make law, particularly regulatory law, too precise, if you not only tell people what the goals are and give them guiding principles, but you tell them exactly how to do things, like worker safety law has 4,000 rules, 7 pages defining what a safe hammer is. So, this kind of stuff, incredibly granular. That if you make law too precise, you turn it into central planning. And people end up spending their whole day walking around with their noses in rule books. And it makes people fail because they don't have either the flexibility or the time to actually make sense of the situation before them. They can't adapt. They can't honor kind of time and resource constraints. They can't do all the things that people need to make things happen. Nothing we do in life can be programmed, or almost nothing can be programmed like a computer. There are all kinds of little value judgments we have to make all day long. And the way law has evolved, it precludes that. It makes people fail. It makes people go nuts. If you're so scared of offending somebody in the workplace, you go to training, never tell a joke. You might offend somebody. Ask somebody what their preferred pronoun is. You might as well have a big blinking light that says, "Don't be yourself." Right? Well, then people don't get along, and people assume the worst of other people. And instead of bringing people together, all these kind of rules about interaction in the workplace drive them apart.
I think it gets us then into the title of the new book, which is Everyday Freedom. What do you mean by everyday freedom as opposed to, I guess, what is everyday freedom, and maybe how is it different or similar to the other types of or definitions of freedom out there?
Yeah, I think that most people think of freedom in a big sense. In a political sense, you can vote for who you want to. In a life sense, you can pursue the kind of career you want to pursue and live where you want to live. And in the case of the First Amendment, supposedly be able to say what you want to say, although that's no longer really quite valid. But what I mean by everyday freedom is the kind of freedom of interaction and freedom of implementation. Letting people act on their judgment and values in trying to get things done. Let's say a school teacher. School teacher needs the authority, the freedom. Freedom, I argue in the book, is a synonym for authority, personal authority. The teacher needs the authority um, to maintain order in the classroom. Otherwise, none of the kids can learn. The teacher needs the authority to adapt to the circumstances of the 30 kids in the classroom and to engage their attention and to earn their moral authority. And if you have the teacher effectively reading a script, then you're almost guaranteed that the kids won't learn because it's too boring. It's all drudgery, right? So people need the freedom to be themselves, and that's the source of pride. You wake up in the morning knowing you can make a difference. And by the way, that's true for a janitor as well as for a teacher, as well as for some senior government official. Everybody needs the freedom to do their job in the best way they can think of doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it gets us. You mentioned you talked to an intellectual historian in the early 90s. I'm wondering if you could give your own intellectual history for how we got to a place where that would be considered normal, what you just described, to where now we have the very rigid and again comprehensive procedure that people have to follow. That gives them a sense that they're powerless and affecting whatever they're trying to affect.
Really good question, and it gets to the heart of the problem. So what I argue in Everyday Freedom is that we can't lead our way out of this, that America is suffering from system failure. And the failure is that we've created a legal and governing system that's designed to make people powerless in their daily choices. It's designed to tell you how to do things or to make you prove by objective evidence that you're doing things correctly. And that system guarantees failure and frustration and is the source not only of government failure. We can't give a permit for a power line, you can't fix a bad school, et cetera, but also it's the source of the populist resentment that's driving, for example, Trump. I mean, people hate the system and they should hate it. What happened is that we woke up to abuses in the 1960s, racism, pollution, gender discrimination, unsafe cars, lies about Vietnam, and we needed to change our values. But the legal experts at the time thought that we could come up with a legal system that not only changed our values, but that guaranteed that there would never again be abuses of authority. And so that's when they came up with this idea that government could be like a software program. That we would have 4,000 rules, the granularity of which is really just astonishing. I mean, the Constitution is 7,500 words. Binding federal law and regulation is 150 million words today. It's, no one can comply with it. I mean, it's just way too much, right? So it's just this impenetrable thicket of law, and it requires, that's why schools now, the total number of students from 1950 to today grew by about double of K-12 students. The number of administrators grew 10 times. So why is that? It's because they're all filling out forms that are, checking the people who are filling out forms. It's bureaucracy exponential. And so healthcare, a third of the healthcare dollar goes to administration. That's over $1 million per doctor. So we've created a system that is designed to fail because we thought we could make it into a software program. Instead, we created this kind of red tape jungle. And we should talk about who's at fault, because while the liberals were the first drivers of this, they wanted to guarantee there were no abuses and they don't trust anybody in business. They wanted to make it detailed, but the conservatives were complicit because there was this idea that Goldwater was very explicit about, but others too, was that authority and freedom were kind of a zero-sum game. The less authority, the more freedom. So they wanted to limit the authority of officials, and one way to do that is to make law very precise. Then the official can't do anything, right? It has to just follow the rules. Trouble is, when you end up having 4,000 rules for worker safety, that also shackles the citizens. So the shackles that supposedly limit the government officials also limit the limit the citizens. So one of the things I talk about in Everyday Freedom, which is somewhat counterintuitive, is that uh, freedom doesn't exist without a framework of authority, and and the authority though is different than what conservatives were concerned about. The authority is not the authority of a kind of an overseer telling you, carrying a whip and telling everybody what to do. The authority that's needed for institutions and for society is the authority at the boundaries to prevent against abuses, to get to in a firm or or a school to maintain standards of performance. And within those boundaries, when everybody knows who's, what the standards are and then people are more free because they don't have to, they can trust that everybody else is abiding by the same values.
That makes sense. It's the basis for a high trust society, a society and a culture of excellence. Um, it reminds me of like something that also that you talked about in the book, that's sort of tying things together, is like how freedom works, how everyday freedom works, how people make decisions. A lot of it's intuition, it's judgment. It's very imprecise, and so when you have a very imprecise, intuitive daily decision making process. If you're a teacher, if you're a janitor, you just have to do things. You're not really thinking about it very rationally. Then it comes up against this very precise legal structure. What happens?
Well, you make people go brain dead. There's
Yeah.
actually a science of this, and it's cognitive overload. I've gotten to be quite friendly with the leading psychologists who study this. Um, so most of human processing is done in our unconscious, and that's where experience and training and values and stuff get melded together into an instinct about what to do when facing different situations. In jobs, doing a job properly is incredibly complex. Being a good
Mhm.
waiter is complex. Who needs it most? Sort of how you juggle being a teacher is astonishingly complex. Almost everything. Digging a hole, you've got to be. Are there power lines overhead? Gas lines underneath? Are there, there are all these things you have to worry about. It's just digging a hole if you're working for the power company or something. So, so humans can be judged by how well they do, but if you actually try to prescribe exactly how they do things, you'll end up diverting their attention from solving the situation to actually doing something um, that makes the situation fail. I'll give you two examples. Um, a doctor, a friend of mine was a university president, and he had talking to a doctor friend, and they're telling a story of the insurance company continually bouncing the forms for the patient. And finally, the doctor got the insurance company person on the phone after days of frustration. Why do you keep bouncing my form for this? And the insurance person says, well, it's because you didn't check the box. Did you ask the patient if she was a smoker? To which the doctor responded, I didn't check that box because the patient is 2 years old. So, so you have, that's just an example. Or here's another example. It was studied by law professor William Simon. They were looking at how bureaucracy interacts with social services. And they were in an office in Boston one day, and a young immigrant mother comes in, and she's apparently filed the forms to get relief. She has 4 children. For the children, she's filed it a day late or something. And she's at the window, and she needs the relief to help feed her children. And the person at the forum says, no, you're too late, blah, blah, blah. And finally the conversation ends and the mother leaves crying with the clerk saying, there is nothing I can do. So the researcher gets up and starts investigating what's going on here. Well, it turns out that the clerk, the bureaucrat who turned away the mother, said there was nothing she could do, but the official in the next office had the authority to waive the late filing. She never bothered to even think about that. So that's an example of somebody who's gone brain dead because they're just looking at the literal forms. The same story with the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. The people were so trained to comply so rigorously with all their checklists that they didn't actually understand how the system worked. The same problem with the Deepwater Horizon gas blowup in the Gulf of Mexico. The regulations required some kind of machine that would prevent blowouts so there wouldn't be pollution that backfired out of the pipe. But it didn't, but it also had the unintended consequence of requiring the pressure to build up so that ultimately the whole rig exploded. And they were just complying with a regulation that said you can't have a little bit of pollution, the result of which is they had a massive amount of pollution. So you have all these kind of regulatory things that prevent people from using their judgment. And it just causes failure. I mean, on so many levels, it causes failure.
That makes sense. It's at the end of the day, it's prudence. It's in particular situations, you make sort of snap judgments, and hopefully you're educated well, or you have a sense for formed well is probably a better way of putting it, though. Yeah, so that you can make the right decision in the right situation.
There's a lot of learning on this. I was friendly with Danny Kahneman, who recently died, the famous psychologist, and he and I would talk about this. So human judgment, which he wrote a lot about, is fallible, right? I mean, people have different values, they have different judgment, they forget different things. And so for important issues, and if you have time, even for sometimes unimportant issues, it's very useful to get different points of view from other people, different ways. It makes you think about things differently. So human cognition can be helpful. But if you drive people from their judgment into the conscious brain, which is like an 8-bit processor compared to the quantum computer of our unconscious, the human brain can only keep track of a few things at once. And if you give them complex checklists and stuff, you more or less literally make them go brain dead. So people no longer are accessing their judgment. And that causes failure. Judgment can be improved, but it can't be replaced. Right. And so we've created a system where human cognition, and by the way, for officials as well as citizens, it turns people into idiots, and people hate it. That's why you get this resentment today in America. People just hate this system where you're just not allowed to do what you think it makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. For a minute, let's go back to 3 Mile Island, because that's a case or a scenario which I think you would agree that we do want regulation. There are all sorts of things that need regulation. And you mentioned this in the book, so I'm wondering if you can tease this out more. If rote procedure in this sort of mind-killing way of doing things is not the way to regulate within a structure for enhancing people's freedom, maybe you could describe a bit more what we would do in a situation like nuclear reactors. I could also think of like airplanes, other pollution, things like that.
Sure. So there was a book a few years ago called The Checklist by Atul Gawande that talked about the importance of running through checklists to prevent tragic accidents for a rocket launch or something.
Sure.
Well, so it turns out that the management theorists use different words for this. A complicated activity is one in which if you make one little mistake, there's a possibility of a giant failure. You cut off the wrong leg in the hospital, or you forget to flip a switch unlocking the flaps of a plane in a famous case in the 30s. So the plane crashes, almost right away. So in those situations where one little mistake causes a tragic accident, uh, it's important actually to go through a kind of um, prescribed checklist to make sure that you're not making a little mistake. But once you've gone through that checklist, even in those situations, you have to go back to the situation where the people are actually using their judgment to fly the airplane or conduct the surgery. You don't conduct surgery by a checklist. You have a lot of skill as a surgeon, and you have to rely on that skill and experience. Then there are things called the word is called complex as opposed to complicated activities, and those are situations where everything involves trade-offs. You're the teacher in a classroom. You have to manage the interest of 30 different kids. You're running a hospital. You have to manage the resources of the cardiac department and the obstetrics department, as well as the emergency room. You can't throw all the resources in one and ignore the other. So you're constantly making trade-offs. Most activities in life, running a firm and other things, are complex. They're not complicated. Um, and in the case of 3 Mile Island, you had a complicated situation. So you wanted people to periodically go through the checklist, but they also needed to understand the interplay between all the different components of nuclear power so that when one dial is off, to be able to think through why that is and what that might mean, in some other situation. So that requires understanding how the different components work together, not simply going through a checklist.
Mm.
And in the case of 3 Mile Island, they had the checklist and they had no understanding. And so what happened is the dials started going off and nobody could put 2 and 2 together to say, oh my goodness, that means 4, and make the right judgment call.
That makes sense. I guess another example more on the flip side, you mentioned in the book something that happened recently close to where I live on I-95 in near Philadelphia. There was a big, I think, a tractor trailer exploded and caused an explosion on the I-95 and shut it down. And you mentioned that it was reopened in 12 days. It was a very quick turnaround, rebuilding this and getting it operational. As we start to, I think, move the conversation towards what we can do or where we can go, maybe you could describe more the details of how that was
Right.
possible to rebuild
Yeah.
this and then how
So
it teaches us.
yeah. So in the case of the I-95, um, Governor Shapiro, just um, called it a state of emergency, which basically meant ignore all the rules on procurement, ignore all the rules on permitting, just ignore all the rules. And he gave his transportation commissioner the authority to just to sit there and waving rules all day long. And and in 12 days it was reopened. I mean, they made a judgment it was an elevated highway to fill up the gap, because that's the easiest way to rebuild a highway is to build up something you can put the highway on top of. It would take months to fabricate, steel girders that would fit. Um, so but dirt would weigh too much and might break the pipes, the infrastructure pipes underneath the ground. So he made a judgment to use broken glass, recycled glass. And they made a contract with a recycled glass company. The trucks started coming day and night. And they just made one judgment after another. And it would have taken a year or more when following the rules, and they opened it in 12 days. And one of the things I think that conservatives have undervalued is that it's really important for government officials to have the authority that goes along with their responsibility to use their judgment. It's also really important for them to be accountable so they can be fired. And I wrote a book about why I think public employee unions should be unconstitutional last year, and I'm working on bringing constitutional challenges to try to prove that. So accountability is important, and we don't have any accountability in government. But authority is also important. And if the official, or I'll use a simple example, if the school principal doesn't have the authority to make different choices, then the parents' ideas don't matter because there's no hub. So authority in government should be kind of like a hub of a wheel where ideas come in and they get sorted out, judgments are made, and the wheel either moves forward or it doesn't work. And hopefully, if it doesn't work, the person's accountable. But today, we've so disempowered people in government, just telling them to follow the rules no matter how stupid they are. Then the irony is that no one's ideas matter. We elect somebody in the White House and they can't give a permit for a transmission line. This is crazy. What's democracy about if not to sort of make the judgments needed to make the common resources work in our society.
Right, and I mean that was, I think, I always like to go back to the American founding. They're always talking about the need for political judgments and also accountability, but also the same sort of regime of authority, and that engenders accountability, because if the president does a bad job, you can get rid of them.
Yeah, exactly. And the Constitution is not is not designed to prevent people from having authority. It's an allocation of powers to give people authority. The president has executive power. The Congress has legislative power. The judges have judicial power, and they all check and balance each other. But they all have to use their judgment, and we have to have a legal structure that allows them to use their judgment. Otherwise, a free society is no longer free. It becomes what we have now is the paralytic society, where everybody's stuck in gridlock, and the horns are honking all day long, but nobody's getting anywhere. And it's really quite serious now, because it's not just affecting our domestic lives, but America can't be strong abroad if we're weak at home. We're paralyzed at home.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. We're talking now about regime level questions, and one of those values of the American regime is that of equality. When we think about the civil rights revolution, which we've kind of alluded to as being the catalyst or the starter for all of these things, I think the principle of the idea was extending equality for all. I guess two of the things that you mentioned in the book, or it ties to two things, one of which is the idea of weaponizing individual rights. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. But also, as again, we're thinking about how things would need to change. I'm wondering, if any at all, how equality plays into the idea of freedom and authority, the way that
Right.
you've laid it out.
Right. Both really important questions. Where there were three tools that we developed after the 1960s to try to prevent abuses. One was this idea of prescriptive rules. The other was this procedures for everything. You have to go through a legal hearing to prove the teacher to prove that Johnny threw the pencil first, or something absurd like that. And the third thing is that we created a mutant version of individual rights. So individual rights that our framers talked about were rights against state authorities. State can't tell you what to say or take away your property or liberty without due process of law. That's great, really important. These new rights were rights against other free people. The manager can't make the judgment that you're a lousy worker, right? Well, that's his job. That's the manager's job to decide who's working well and who's not. And now all of a sudden, the quote rights of the employee, because they claim some sort of some minority status or whatever, trumps the rights for everyone else. The university campuses, we have people, claiming that they're oppressed, and they're using that claim to oppress other people, so they're not allowed to say what they think. I mean, it's literally madness. I mean, it's a form of it's turning rights into the opposite of rights, turning rights into a sword, to get your own way. So this idea of rights, I mean, a free society has a structure, has a formal structure. Law sets boundaries, and the boundaries are negative. You can't pollute, you can't steal, blah, blah, blah. And they're all on the outside. And inside those boundaries is a corral of freedom. And people are free to get along, not get along. It's like atoms in a test tube bouncing back and forth. People associate with each other or not, or disassociate based on their own values or instincts or goals. And that's how a free society works. And after the 1960s, what we did is we took that idea of law as a fence around a corral of freedom and had law reach into the field of freedom to mediate and adjudicate daily interactions by people. So it no longer, the field of freedom became a minefield. It's a legal minefield where you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that. I mean, wait a minute. People say I can use whatever pronoun I want to use. It's a free society. And if you don't want to work with me, you don't have to work with me, or you can fire me. But in a free society, law shouldn't be telling people how to get along with people. You can have a principle of anti-discrimination on the outside, that's fine. But you can't take that down to individual interactions very effectively. Law can only go so far. And what we've done is, in the name of freedom, we've taken away freedom. So this is, again, the source of the populist resentment. And again, another example of what I think of as the system failure of modern government. It's not a failure of just mainly of policy, it's a failure of execution. We don't let people do things. We don't let people be themselves. It's tragic. It's no longer America.
Yeah, I mean, that I agree with everything you just said. I've got two more questions for you. First, I think we're both on the same page that there's a large appetite for rectifying the problems that we have in terms of this feeling of powerlessness. I think there's a great sense of anxiety about where America is going, not just about who gets elected in the next election, but American society writ large. There's, I think, a large anxiety about where we are right now and where we could be going, and a sense that the status quo as it is cannot really sustain itself for much longer. My question to you is, I wonder how much of an appetite there is for everyday freedom in the sense of people who actually want to exercise authority and responsibility. And just one example would be, like, Congress doesn't really have any meaningful authority. I think everyone recognizes that. I think one reason for that is that they don't have a lot of incentive to take it back for themselves as the Article 1, Section 1 branch. They're much happier to leave that to the technocrats to do in the executive administrative state, and then they can complain during oversight hearings. So I'm wondering how, institutionally and culturally, even if we want to fix the problems that we have, are we ready for, or what's your sense, are we ready for actually taking responsibility and accountability again?
Yeah, really good question. Government is filled with people today who actually don't want the authority. I mean, Congress doesn't want to take authority. They might get blamed. They just want to point fingers. Both parties, by the way. This is not my complaint about the Tea Party movement, which is now graduated into the kind of MAGA movement, is that it's entirely negative. It correctly points out the failures of government, but has no positive governing vision. And we've made it very hard for people to do public service. You have to. It's excruciating to to get appointed to a serious government job, what you have to go through, and all the restrictions and sacrifices you have to make. And then it's hard to even to be a full-time government. You want to run a department because you will feel better. But you're not given the authority to manage the department because of union rules and civil service rules and such. So you can't even, if you're motivated to do well, you're frustrated by all this. So um, I think America needs a new movement. It has to be a movement of people who actually believe in taking responsibility, who believe in letting other people take responsibility and in holding them accountable. And hopefully it can take over it can take over a party. I think the Republican Party is in disarray, and the Democratic Party is it's almost like a balkanized series of little tribes, many of which are incredibly destructive of the social fabric, in my view. So I and the way to start, I think, is to change the narrative. And the narrative is not mainly, in the first instance, one of leadership. The narrative is one of kind of common sense. It's a one of changing the system so that people can at least try to make sense of the situation in front of them, and to confront the fact that every single area of society, that certainly every area of interaction in the public sphere, schools, healthcare, the way government regulates, all those things are broken. Their brokenness cannot be disputed. So what's the vision for making them work? Neither party has a vision. So I have a vision. It's a human responsibility and accountability vision. Give people the freedom in their implementation to try to make sense of the school, of whatever it is. Let doctors and nurses spend their day taking care of people, not filling out forms. That requires changing the system. All these things require. So we're at one of these points where, I think the closest analogy is the progressive era, when we changed our philosophy. We said, well, we can't allow, factory owners to mangle young children who are workers or whatever. We've got to have some measure of oversight there. So we got the progressive era, initially for the better, I think, and then now ultimately for the worse. And we need a similar change in philosophy, away from legal micromanagement towards a human responsibility model, and which is the model that our country was founded on. And this is the big deal. It's a big change, and it's a 10 or 20 year process to do that. But I think we'll never get America back until we do it.
That makes sense. My last question, going back to the example of Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania with I-95, he called a state of emergency. So he said, we have this big catastrophe that sort of necessitates us to dispense with all of the regulations and these long drawn out processes so that we can get it done quick, so we can get back to normal. That was an exceptional situation. I think you and I would say, well, we want that to be the sort of everyday situation where you can move quickly. There's accountability. If it went badly, he would, bear the responsibility for botching the repair. My question is, how can we move from we get to dispense with all of the long drawn out processes and exceptional situations and make that here's how we're going to do politics on a day to day, or here's how we're going to do life on a day to day.
So here's how you do that structurally. So that was mainly, there were permitting issues there and procurement issues. Those were the two basic areas that were waived. Those two different areas. There need to be a series of special commissions that take huge volumes of rules for procurement, for example, tens of thousands of pages, and turn them into a pamphlet with guidelines and with where the most important thing is an oversight body that will get over the hurdle of distrust, because no one trusts anybody in government. They think they're all going to be on the take. So I think in the case of large procurement contracts, which, by the way, I don't think this one qualifies. The one in Pennsylvania wasn't so big. I mean, but if you're buying a $10 billion IT system for the federal government, that's a big contract. I would have a group of retired people who know something in different areas be a kind of oversight committee that would have the authority to approve contracts that were already negotiated. You would get rid of the 10,000 pages, have a series of principles and guidelines, and you would have some kind of oversight approval process just so that people don't think everybody's on the take for really big contracts. And that would be it. You simply replace what we have now with something that's more like what we had 70 years ago. And you would, in the case of healthcare, you would, instead, so the doctors and nurses don't spend half the day filling out forms, you would go from this incredibly convoluted system of Medicaid and Medicare and all the insurance company stuff. You would have a series of standardized plans. You would use AI as a way to catch outliers who are prescribing too many opioids or too many surgeries or whatever. You would have a after the fact kind of settlement mechanism rather than a before the fact approval process for every single procedure. So you basically replace all these current systems, which have all evolved in ways that nobody anticipated and now are like sediment in the harbor, right? So it's so thick that nobody can get it anywhere. You would replace them with dramatically simplified systems with oversight mechanisms that are judgment based, not technical based, not compliance based. And it has to be, it has to happen in every area of society. I mean, there's no, you can't elect. We could elect. I see George Washington behind you in your office, your picture. If we elected George Washington president today, he couldn't do what's needed because it's illegal to do what's needed. So the first step is to give back to George Washington the responsibility to be George Washington, and the authority that goes along with that. And so, there are a whole series of commissions that need to be run. If you ask me what my ambition is to be appointed to run these commissions, to rewrite the laws of the United States so people can use their common sense again. It actually is not that hard. It's hard to write 150 million words telling people how to do everything all day long. It's actually relatively easy to write a series of goals and principles aimed at worker safety. There are lots of industry guidelines or other things. It's not, it's actually not that hard to do things that are activated by humans taking responsibility. What's hard is to replace human judgment.
That sounds great. We'll have to tell the next president to put you in charge of, or the next Speaker of the House to put you in charge of these commissions. But Philip, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. The book for all of our listeners is Everyday Freedom. We'll put it in our show notes so they can go buy it and read it. And if people want to follow more of your work, where would you recommend that they go look?
Well, we have the organization, the nonprofit I run, it's nonpartisan, it's commongood.org. So we have newsletters, they can sign up, it's free. We work with leading think tanks like AEI and sometimes Heritage, also Progressive Policy Institute or the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So we're because we're interested in just making things work, we tend to cross ideological borders. And so we're do a lot of things with universities. I have an appointment at Columbia University and arm of the economics department. But go to commongood.org, and we're looking for good ideas, and I hope your listeners, if they're interested, will get in touch with us.
Awesome. Thanks again, Phillip. Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.